why we in Catholic Church have glass stained windows and everything else to help those people that can't read.
Yeah, I was listening to I think Bishop Barron. He was saying, I mean, that cathedral. Chardonnay. He said that's because most people didn't read.
That's right.
So it says, so let's look at the pictures where you see the images, so you get a better idea. So
that's why you have the little shrines and so forth. And everybody, this is for free. Now, I think mine is in here someplace. If you run across one of these things with a lot of writing in it, check it out. If there's a lot of writing in it, that's mine. I don't know where it is. It's in here someplace.
Okay.
Well, it's in here someplace.
No, I'm not checked in or anything. Do I need to do anything? I didn't
No.
sign up.
There you
Sir?
go.
Oh, so he is like. Okay.
Now, again, if you run across one of these that has writings in it, let me know.
Dude, can I get your email address?
HC39013@AOL.com. Right. Okay. Yes. Take one of these books.
So I just probably.
I've got obviously more books I know what to do with, but anyway. All right, are we ready to go? Now, I'm going to start this off a little bit differently because originally I was a classics, and language is very important because we're going to go over, this is poetry, Greek, Hebrew poetry, and
Test. Yeah.
All right. Okay, we're going to start out with a prayer, please. And I'm going to start off a little differently than usual, just to get you in the frame of mind of thinking about foreign languages. In nomine Patri et Filii et Spiritui Sancti. Amen. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. And you'll find that that is, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be. There is nothing new under the sun, and that will be picked up in Ecclesiastes. We're going to start out with Proverbs, and these are all done by, in theory, attributed to Solomon. Actually, they're probably collections of his. Solomon lived in 970 to 930 BC, the son of David, actually about the ninth son, but he was the chosen one to follow David. Now you'll notice David's regime is going to be like about 1,000, so this is why, there's a millennium, 1,000 years between David and Christ. And so people were looking for the Messiah at that time with Christ. Now, with the wisdom literature, the word wisdom is chokhmah in Hebrew. There's a lot of aspiratives in Hebrew. If you're writing it down in English, it's Khokmah. W-O-K-H-M-A-H. And what that is the practical application of knowledge. And so wisdom is something that is attributable to stone cutting, wood carving, as well as many practical things. Now, wisdom also appears in Genesis. Does anybody know why wisdom would appear in Genesis at the beginning? Are there any answers? Mary? Okay, she says this has to do with the redemption of Adam. Well, what happens at the beginning in Genesis? You are creating order out of chaos. And that's kind of what wisdom is all about. Now, how many of you raise children? Okay, you understand that then, that it takes wisdom to raise children. And wisdom itself also kind of has this historical sense that it's going to be passed from parents to children. In other words, these Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon is education that's going to be passed. And you'll get into this right away because it's basically the father talking to his son about the birds and the bees, among other things. So wisdom happens to be at the beginning, and it's order out of chaos. And this is basically because I believe it's an attribute, wisdom is an attribute of God, and it's passed on to us. And in Proverbs here, it's going to be passed on what they call the Lady of Wisdom, who passes throughout the universe or the world, and it can be called upon by anybody. Now, the reasons why they have Lady of Wisdom is because in Hebrew, Chokmah is a feminine word. Now, you might be in a lot of other languages, I don't care whether it's French, Spanish, Hebrew, or whatever, a lot of things are either feminine, masculine, or neutral. In other words, there is a generic, you have basically various types of attachments to words, whether it's going to be, like I say, a masculine word, in French, fermer la porte. You have to know when to put an LA in front of a word and LE, to make sure that it's a feminine or a masculine word. Now, another thing about this is in poetry. Now, there are several different types of poetry. In English, you're kind of used to things rhyming, like Mary had a little lamb, its fleece, it was white as snow, and everywhere Mary went, the lamb was sure to go. So you got snow and go rhyming. There are other languages where meter is important, a certain beat to it. The beginning of, for example, Aeneid, Virgil's Aeneid, Arma vorumque cano Troiae qui primus laboris, that's how it begins. And it's also poetry in that form of a beat is good for the memory, because that's how these people could memorize all this stuff, is kind of a through either meter or, rhyming and so forth. In Hebrew poetry, you're going to have kind of like three, or actually it's four types, but definitely with three, where you have a line and then the next line can either be reinforcing, like a positive, or negative, or something kind of neutral. You'll be able to read this in the introduction of this book when you go over it tonight or before the next meeting. And there's also acrostics in the 31st or the last of the Proverbs. It starts with at the beginning of the Hebrew alphabet and goes through, all the way from, And then each line will then fill out, the Greek or the Hebrew alphabet. Okay, where do we get that word alphabet? Does anybody know? And what's the second one? Beta. Alpha, beta, alphabet. That's where we get this. And so, believe it or not, there's a lot of Greek, even in our literature, when we used to have the Kyrie eleison, that's Greek. And also, when you walk into the church, the first thing, when you look down and you see that intra ebo ad altare ad Dei, I shall enter onto the altar of God. And then up front, you've got Sanctus, Sanctus, Sanctus in the tiles way up front, holy, holy, holy. So there's, any intellectual words, they're going to be either, Greek or Latin or a combination of both. And so language is important. Now, the one thing about Greek poetry also is that in order to describe spiritual or the works of passion, they're going to use kind of concrete objects. Oh, we do the same thing in English. For example, he gave me a cold shoulder. Well, that's, that kind of describes, somebody that's kind of aloof from you. But the idea of a cold shoulder is an example. Or I can warm up to her, again, it's, again, using warmth, towards somebody else. So we have a lot of phrases like that, and so you're going to run into a lot of idioms in Hebrew that a story needs to be told to kind of explain that. When I was growing up, for example, one hipster would say to another hipster, "Hey, he's real cool, Daddy-o," referring to the other hipster. So you get all sorts of some of those idioms kind of go out of style. And so we will kind of start out, we've had a little bit about what wisdom is, and the bottom line to a lot of this, whether it's going to show up in Proverbs many times, and Ecclesiastes, is the fear of the Lord. Now, who knows what we mean by fear of the Lord? Okay, anything else? Respect, says Mary. Anything else by anybody? Because this is essential. If you can get this, what the fear of the Lord is. Okay, awe, A-W-E. Okay, anything else? Love, yes. Fear of, yes, you don't want to disappoint God. Or fear of judgment. Anybody else on this? Again, it's a very, you're right, it's a very deep respect for God and to accept His wisdom, to be open to God's wisdom, to be open to God's divine intervention in your life. The reason for that is that, for example, a fool is a person that thinks, oh, I know everything. I don't need God. I can do it on my own. And believe me, he is a fool for being so focused just on himself. And you're going to get popular philosophies on that too. About, yes, Mary?
Would you say it's also just
yes. It's God's moral law, yes. That's correct. You need to obey God's law. Which brings us into Genesis. Eve and Adam. What did they do wrong? What did they do? Where did they go wrong? That's right. They thought that they could become God, just like God. In other words, there was the tree of life or the tree of good and evil. Yes, Mary?
and also Adam did not.
Yes, Mary is saying that Adam was supposed to defend Mary, or by Eve. Mary will become the new Eve, and Adam will become Jesus. In other words, Jesus is the new Adam. And they're to tend that garden. Now, again, God told them that they are just only to eat of this is the divine rule, you just eat of the tree of life and not of this other one. Well, they disobedience. They did not follow God's moral law. And yes, Mary?
What did they think was going to happen?
I don't think they did think of that. That's the problem, because they were deceived by the devil. The devil is a great deceiver. Yes, yes, Matt, go ahead.
They weren't thinking about the consequences.
Yes, Matt is saying yes. They didn't even think about the consequences. Paradise will be satisfied later on. Yes. Yeah, Cinnamon, you have something to say? Well, they used their freedom the wrong way, didn't they? They had the freedom of choice. We all have a freedom of choice of doing the right thing or the wrong, and they went the wrong way. This is yes. Go ahead, Peter.
They, in their freedom,
All right, Peter's saying they could define good or evil.
something that they could decide. Not
Yes. Yes, yes. Just a minute. Paul, would you pass this to Peter? Peter, can you repeat that?
It's not just that we choose badly or fall sinfully. It's their decision, and it's in all of us, is to decide that we can define what is good and evil. We can say that X is good when it's not. Not simply choose otherwise, but actually create otherwise. That's the original sin. John Paul II writes about this in the first part of his The Theology of the Body, that there is both original innocence, which is not totally erased, what you were saying about our being good, or I guess Father was saying about it at Mass this morning, original innocence and original sin. If original innocence is totally wiped away, if we are totally depraved, that is Lutheranism. That everything is saved only by grace without any kind of cooperation, that we're incapable of cooperating. That's the Lutheran heresy. But in fact, going back to something you mentioned earlier, I agree with what you were saying, but there be not only in Genesis is it not only creating or bringing order out of chaos, it's creating out of nothing. The Leibniz, one of the people who invented calculus, he said the question is, why is there anything instead of nothing? Instead of nothing. God created out of nothing, ex nihilo. That's the term that Aquinas uses. And then there's theological discourse about what does it mean then in the idiom of Exodus, or of Genesis, that there is also the creation of order out of chaos, but before there's chaos, there's zero. So it's a great mystery, the existence of anything, and then that we would deny that by our choice because we're exercising our freedom falsely. The freedom which makes us in the image and likeness of God, but we are not God. That's the thing that we forget when we decide to define what is good or evil. I'm wondering, is this, okay, I just wanted to comment on that. There's nuances there that are, like you were saying earlier, it's a huge mystery. The mystery of God, and that the gifted access we have to Him even as creatures who can not only take the wrong turn, but go off the rails altogether by choosing to define what is good and evil falsely. Yeah.
Okay, so you can see why, exactly what Peter had to say. You have the rise and fall of Jewish history, up and down, up and down. You have those, some good kings and many bad kings, and they're either falling away, they're going into idolatry. Bad things are going to happen when that happens, and then there's a swing the other way. So if you can understand the whole concept of this fear of God. Yes, Mary? Peter was willing to, St. Peter, was willing to fall upon the Lord and ask for His forgiveness. And Judas never did. Yeah, well, go ahead. Yes, we're going through a period of political correctness, how other people are telling us how to behave, even though, again, they're not following the rule of God. So now, another way also kind of leading into being attached to the wisdom of God is through meditation. Now, what is meditation? Does anybody have an answer to that? Okay, prayer. What are you focusing in on when you do the prayer? Okay, that's fine. You see, there's a lot of younger people that think that meditation is emptying of the mind, and I tell you that's the wrong way to go, because that's going to give you a good opening for the devil to enter in. You want to focus in on Scripture. In other words, meditate on Scripture, and that's what the Jews did here with Proverbs especially, is they went over and over. They meditated on what was written, all these different types of teachings and how to apply them in their lives. It's teaching, yeah, and passing on, but it's also for young people, for the wise too, it'll point in. You know, all of us need that. Now, at this point in, because I'm going to wrap this up at about 11 o'clock, Kirk, can you put on, there's going to be a tape now from Father Kotursky, who is a wisdom professor at Fordham University in New York City, and even though he's a white-haired man, and you think he's very old, well, he is, but I'm older than he is, so. Oh, he did die? Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Oh, it's a very brilliant man. Well, until we get going here, why don't we just, we got it going? All right, okay.
These lectures are titled Biblical Wisdom Literature, Part 1.
Lecture 1, yes, please.
I'm Father Joseph Kotursky from the Department of Philosophy at Fordham University in the Bronx. Most of my work is on the great philosophers of history, but I also have a great love of the Bible. Perhaps you do too. Some parts of the Bible are probably better known than others. I think, for instance, of the wonderful stories of the book of Genesis, the stories about Jesus and the Gospels, the stories of the liberation of the chosen people from their captivity in Egypt. This course will examine some of the lesser-known books of the Bible, and particularly the books of biblical wisdom literature, such as the haunting story of Job, a man afflicted even though innocent, the constant exhortations to fidelity that occur in the book of Proverbs or the book of Sirach. I think that this set of books of the Bible is of great significance for those who are believers, as well as for those who may not believe, but perhaps are still searching, precisely because of its concentration on some of the great problems, such as human suffering, or the education of our young people, the ways in which we seek to grow in virtue and to avoid vice, the ways in which we try to make decisions and learn how to make better and more prudential decisions, both about the specific questions of life as well as about questions of vocation and career, or the kind of trust that we need to exhibit when we're making new friends or choosing marriage partners. Our questions for this course will be about those topics. And in particular, right here at the start, I'd like to concentrate a little bit, as an example, about what the Bible has to say about the problem of suffering. For we all know the fact that there is suffering in the world, and sometimes simply awful things happen to good people. That problem of suffering is something that we can approach from many perspectives, from philosophy, but also from the Bible. And what I'd like to concentrate on in this course is what the Bible has to teach us in this regard. When we think about suffering, we might be doing it from our own acquaintance. Perhaps we've had strong cases of personal suffering in our own lives. Perhaps we've simply known very close at hand family members or friends who've had significant suffering. Or maybe we're simply thinking about people far off, people we've seen on television, things we've only read about, and the sufferings they have that they just don't seem to deserve. When the suffering really hits home, whether by virtue of what we've read or perhaps by virtue of what we ourselves have found, I find that some people have the experience of really having their faith tested, sometimes losing their faith. God can seem so unjust that they just cannot allow themselves to believe in that sort of God anymore. Or other people tend to blame themselves. That is, they get a sense, and rightly so, that there's a connection between sin and guilt and its consequences. And there can arise in a person a torturous sense that they must somehow be responsible if someone they know is suffering, perhaps their children, and they make this connection. So what I'd like to ask in this course, right here at the start, by way of an example of our approach to biblical wisdom literature, is what the Bible has to say about it and what we might take away from it, whether we ourselves are believers, perhaps Jewish or Christian or Muslim. We do so because we have a deep respect for the Bible, precisely as God's Word, something that was indeed revealed to us, and it has an effect for those at the time that it was revealed, but then also has a deep effect and a significance for us today. But I think that this material will also be of great hope even for folks who are non-believers, for people who are perhaps searching or simply interested, who are alert to the way in which the Bible has shaped human culture, shaped the culture especially of the West, and that knowing more about the Bible will help us even understand our current culture and those whose minds and whose hearts are shaped by this biblical understanding. I think that the Bible has an awful lot to teach us then about many questions, including the question of human suffering. Why, for example, God seems to allow deep suffering, why it is inappropriate to start blaming oneself simply because one is suffering or somebody whom you know is suffering, that there's more in that question that we need to examine. And so our reflection upon these biblical themes will give us the opportunity to do that. We'll also look at many other questions that the biblical wisdom literature offers. My own interest in coming to this is multifaceted. As a teacher of philosophy there at Fordham, I'm fascinated with biblical wisdom literature because it is the most philosophical. It's that part of the Bible, books like Job or Koheleth, which are filled with questions about the meaning of human existence, about some of life's most important questions, not only the endurance of suffering, the question of the suffering of the innocent, but how to show our compassion toward others who are suffering, how to educate our children, and all those other big problems of the wisdom literature. Now, we philosophers tend to be a little bit skeptical. We want to know why things are the way they are. We want to know how it is that people claim to know what they claim to know, and whether their arguments, whether their evidence is sufficient. I'm absolutely amazed the way in which the Bible's wisdom books show some of that same questioning attitude. I also bring the perspective of belief from a particular faith tradition. I'm a Catholic Christian, in fact, a Jesuit priest, and I think that there is something from this tradition that I can bring to bear that will be of great interest both to those who share my convictions and belong to the same household of the faith, and to those who are not, but who are interested and perhaps searching. Let me raise the question quite directly. You may be saying at this point, should I continue with this lecture, this series, given the perspective of the lecturer? And I would certainly hope so, especially because of the intrinsic importance of the Bible, of this common biblical material which Jews and Christians and other people of the book share. It's also something that this particular tradition has that I think is of genuine and common human wisdom. And so I'd like to share some of those perspectives. And I can only think about how much in my own life and in my own course of studies I have learned regularly by reading and studying the perspectives that come from traditions that are not my own, either not my own religiously or not my own convictions philosophically. And so I would hope that this sort of discussion from this perspective will be interesting to you and helpful. I've tried to provide some discussion questions at the end of each of our lectures, and my hope is that that will also provide something for the lively sharing of different perspectives. I hope that you will share my interest in this sapiential literature as part of our common human heritage, the way in which human culture has emerged, especially in the West. It's something that remains important, deeply important for the Jewish community as well as for the Christian community. Let me say a few things here at the beginning also just about this Christian perspective on things. Christians take the very center of the Bible to be the person of Christ. In regard to the question of suffering that I'd like to begin with in this lecture series, Jesus presents himself as an innocent man who is he's a paradigm case of innocent suffering. And whether one shares that particular matter of belief about his divinity, it's very useful to know how Christians come at this material. According to the Christian faith, Jesus of Nazareth is the Son of God, who then took on human nature and became man for our salvation. We call that the incarnation. Even if one does not share that particular belief, there's still a lot to learn from him. He is a case in a way that's like the case of Job from earlier in the Scriptures, one who is entirely just and innocent, and yet, in his case, one who consciously accepts the suffering. In fact, he goes to his death precisely, he says, for the rest of us. In what the New Testament records of his deeds and of his words, he explained his own embrace of suffering in some of the very same categories that the Bible in its earlier portions used for the problem of the innocent suffering. One thinks of the ways, for example, in which he quotes Isaiah or alludes to Job. He envisioned himself as making a sacrificial offering of himself, and then of completing what earlier figures in biblical history had begun. There's a way in which he is the new Adam, recapitulating the earlier Adam. There's a way in which he's like Abraham and Isaac and Moses, and is trying to complete what they had begun. Toward the end of our course, we'll leave some time specifically for that consideration of Jesus and his own deeds and words, but there's a way in which reflection on that can also add something to the dimension of what we want to study in looking at some of these earlier books. And we turn then to the specific question about suffering in the Bible. It's a theme that is recounted in any number of the parts of the Bible. For instance, in the early portion, which is called Torah, the law, it's also described in very interesting ways and reflected upon in the writings of the prophets. But it's of a special interest in the books that are the sapiential part of the Bible, the biblical wisdom books. What we'll be doing in our course is going through those books and perhaps comparing one with another on a given topic, like the topic of suffering. One sees it in a book like Job precisely because we have an innocent man here who is without blame. If he's not entirely sinless, he's at least not guilty of the sort of sin that provoked the amount of suffering that he has. But we'll take that perspective and compare it with the perspective that we find in other books, such as the book of Proverbs. There's a way in which, and perhaps I'm showing my cards here as a philosopher, there's a way in which this is a bit of a debate, and a debate in which the Bible itself is entering, but also, I would hope, in which you're entering. And I suggest that precisely because in this discussion on problems like suffering, there's insight to be gained by the way in which the biblical figures themselves discuss it and the way in which we react to that. So one finds here in this something of the philosophical character. There's something about the different points of view that humans are capable of that's extremely interesting. And then there's also what divine wisdom has to communicate to us about these sufferings. I think of the wonderful Jewish scholar from whom I have learned so much, Gerhard von Rad. In his book, Wisdom in Israel, he reflects on this, and he does a terrific job. It's one of those books that I hope you'll be interested in consulting as the result of this course. In the course of these lectures on biblical wisdom, we will be looking at all these various questions, but beginning with this problem of suffering as our opening gambit, because it is so engaging, the case of the incomprehensible suffering of the character of Job. The scene that we are to see in the beginning of Job and his troubles is Job seated on the ground with ashes thrust upon his head, his garments torn. But interestingly, he's not there alone. We see him in the company of three of his friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, and they are sitting there with him grieving. In fact, they're practicing a wonderful custom within Judaism called sitting Shiva. The custom is that one sits with someone who is suffering, sometimes conversing, sometimes simply being compassionate toward a person who is suffering, and sitting there in silence, waiting for the person who is suffering to begin to speak. as they're sitting there, we are also given, Job is not, but we are also given a sense of a perspective from on high. Namely, that while his friends think of Job as suffering from some kind of suffering because of the way in which he's being punished, Job is insisting that he is not being punished. And in fact, we are given a sense from the earlier parts of Job that he is not someone who is in fact suffering because of sin, but rather it's a kind of divine test. He's described in those opening chapters as wholehearted and upright, a man who feared God and who shunned evil. And we're seeing in part of those opening chapters the council of heaven, in which a figure, a very curious figure, by the name of Satan, is there in conversation with the other angels before God. In our later tradition, Satan is the name for a true demon or devil, and there's a good reason for that. Here at this point in the course of biblical revelation, the name Satan doesn't yet have all of those connotations. He's one of the heavenly council, and his name simply means the accuser. True to his name, Satan makes an accusation, and the accusation is this. He says to God, Job is only being reverential. Job is only being faithful and praising you because of his prosperity. And so what Satan the accuser does is to suggest a kind of a devilish trial. Maybe that's why we start thinking of him as a devil, and why in subsequent tradition that's the name for the chief devil like Lucifer. The test is this. If Job were to be deprived of what he most loved, would he still show that same devotion to God? Or would he now start cursing God because of what he has had to suffer? God, trusting that Job will be faithful in bad times as well as in good, God allows Job to be tried and to be tested on the condition that his life be spared. There will be severe losses, but the losses that are inflicted upon Job will never touch his life. So in this opening scene where we've got Job being tested, we also see these three friends of his sitting Shiva with him. That goes on for quite some number of chapters. More than half the book is devoted to those conversations. We'll have the chance to consider those conversations in lectures 8 and 9 and 10. For the moment, it's enough to notice simply that these friends all assume that Job must have been guilty, and in fact, guilty of something serious enough to have provoked such enormous suffering. Job, on the other hand, insists that he is innocent, that if he sinned, like any man has sinned, he's at least never done anything that was so egregious as to deserve a suffering as horrendous, the loss of his children, the loss of his property, the loss of his servants. He's no more guilty than anybody else. Reluctant to speculate on the possible reasons for his suffering, Job insists instead, from the posture of faith, that even in his darkness, that even in his suffering, God will come to his help. There's a very beautiful passage in which he says, I know that my Redeemer lives. And he insists that he will be proven innocent, if only he can have his day in court. And so his greatest insistence is precisely on getting his chance to have the trial. After a lengthy conversation in which various angles are tried in order to figure out this problem, a new character emerges on the scene, a much younger man, not like Job's friends, perhaps of his same age, a man named Elihu. And Elihu, with all the great confidence of which sometimes the young are capable, Elihu suggests he knows God's mind, and he can show that God is perfectly just. But if God is perfectly just and innocent, then Job must somehow be guilty. Well, hardly has Elihu finished his speech. What do you know? God himself appears, a grand theophany, and God refuses to submit himself to any court proceedings, the ones that Job has been pleading for. Instead, God vindicates Job's innocence. This is a faithful man whom he had known from the beginning would be faithful despite his trials. And God castigates the presumption of Elihu and the misjudgment of Job's trio of friends. In fact, at God's directive, Job starts pleading for his friends so that they will be spared punishment themselves for any presumption that may have had. Then there's the problem of the ending of the book of Job. In the epilogue, there's a scene in which Job gets the restoration of his fortunes. He gets new children. His prosperity is returned. And it's a story that, part of the story that we can very much love because it's the happy ending. But some scholars think that it may have been added by those thinkers who weren't so much following out the internal logic of Job, the tragedy of life and the need to have faith in the midst of tragedy, but perhaps was added by people who shared one of the perspectives of the Bible's other wisdom books, the book of Proverbs. We'll discuss that problem when we get to Lecture 12, so I simply want to whet your appetite for some of the philosophical debate that we need to have. As we ponder this, what it seems to me that the text itself shows is the incredible fidelity of Job, the way in which he is absolutely steadfast in insisting God will show his utter rectitude and he will correct injustice and misfortune. It seems to me that the Bible is pondering this and pondering it deeply by the way in which Job, the book of Job, as well as the character of Job shows it, and the other biblical texts are in conversation with it. What we need to do is to look at the questions here. The general question of suffering, the use to which suffering might be put, because many of the spiritual writers reflecting upon the Bible have seen in this advice for how we ourselves are to conduct our own lives in a time of suffering, and how we're to deal with those who are put in our path, our family members or our friends. We'll consider the relative merits of being silent and listening, trying to elicit perhaps a sense of what people are feeling. And then we'll consider the better and the worse ways in which one should speak. Not everything that one thinks of saying is always the most compassionate thing to say to someone who is suffering. We'll consider a little bit some possible ways to pray in the midst of suffering, the way to endure in patience and perseverance, the way to hope. Let me now turn for a few minutes to what the course as a whole will look like. The anguish of Job speaks so loudly to us, but there are lots of other problems that are addressed in the Bible's sapiential books. We'll find ways to examine these various books from a number of perspectives. We need to look at the texts themselves, the genres in which the writers are using and trying to explore problems of wisdom, their place within the Bible as a whole. We'll look at the questions theologically and philosophically that these books pose, the answers that they give. We'll look at the ways in which we might use some of these answers in our own lives. And we'll also look at the question about human wisdom, about divine revelation, and about human response to divine revelation. There's very interesting questions in those matters. The order that we'll use for the topics in this course is roughly chronological. We don't know with utter accuracy the dates of many of these books. At best, we can put them in a certain historical period. And even then, there's some scholarly dispute about which came first, or perhaps the ways in which the texts were developed. But we'll be using for this course the rough chronological order that scholars have established through the books of Proverbs, Job that we've been discussing, Koheleth, which is also called Ecclesiastes, Sirach, known as Ecclesiasticus in some traditions, the Song of Songs, sometimes called the Canticle of Canticles, the book of Daniel, the Wisdom of Solomon. And then toward the end of the course, we'll save 3 lectures for the Gospels, in which Jesus shows himself connected very deeply with the sages of earlier biblical wisdom. In addition to those books, there's also the Bible's prayer book, the Psalms. There are many different types of psalms, but some of those 150 psalms seem to me to be very clearly belonging to a group of didactic poetry that we call the wisdom psalms. I'll be making use of those psalms as a kind of interlude within this course at various points. After we've considered one or another book, we'll use those psalms to sort of take a moment apart and to think about how to reflect on what we've just studied in the books, perhaps how to pray about it, and to reflect on what the problem is before we go on to the next book. There are various sources, of course, for wisdom. I'd like to mention 3 in particular. There is the experience that we have and the reflection upon our personal experience, or vicariously the experience that others have that we come to know about, perhaps read about. Secondly, there's a reflection that we have to make on the nature of things. Sometimes the way things are is really explaining to us more about how to deal with it and perhaps God's intent. And finally, there's a source of wisdom that is divine revelation. So whether we're doing this from the point of view of literature or history or philosophy, there is a kind of wisdom, and biblical wisdom is strong in teaching us about this, that comes through prayer and through meditation and through insight from this revealed set of texts. We will then do well to be asking ourselves regularly as we study this, what is it that's coming from human reflection on experience? What is it that's coming from nature? What is it that's coming from God and from the way in which He's trying to elicit a response to us? I think that in making this kind of study, that both those who are believers and non-believers alike will find much of great interest in these materials. There's something that even a believer who has already made use of these texts may find helpful. You know, sometimes we get into patterns and habits, for example, habits of prayer, where we tend regularly to do it the same way. And what I have found in my own experience, for instance, of making retreats and of reading books on this subject, is that it can be really helpful to have people suggest new ways of praying or new ways of reading a text. So I'm hopeful that this study will be useful for those who are believers in perhaps deepening and broadening their ways of praying. My preliminary note at this point is this: if you already have a method that works for you, the best advice that I can give is stick with it. But sometimes people are looking for a new way, and so I hope that what I have to offer will be taken in that spirit. And for those who are not particularly given to prayer or to reflection in that mode, it may be interesting just to know what believers do and what this phenomenon of prayer is about. It will be helpful in understanding others with whom we meet and deal, and perhaps give us suggestions of something analogous in our own life. I think, for instance, of some of the great philosophers who had a habit of meditation that, even though it wasn't particularly directed to God, was still extremely prayerful. Our course will consider these questions then about what the Bible has to offer and what human experience has to do in responding to that. And in the course of our lectures, we will look at these one after the other. In the next lecture, I'll begin by doing this with the oldest of the biblical wisdom literature, namely the book that's called Proverbs. But to set us up for this, perhaps I should speak for just a moment about translations, because when one is using ancient texts like these, we're presumably going to be reading them in English rather than them in the original language. There are many wonderful translations of the Bible that are available. In fact, I would urge that you consider using different translations in the course of your study. As we move through the text, we'll be looking at a number of different English translations, and by that sample, we'll see some of the variety that's possible. If you have a Bible translation that's already available, or one that for reasons of your own that you prefer, that's perfectly fine. It can be helpful both to use that text as well as the one that I'll be using, and I'll identify which one at points in the course of our series. It's useful to have several of these running, if only to see what a given translator has emphasized by choosing this way rather than that way to render a given passage. Which translation is a good one? Well, I think the best thing to consider here is that we do need a translation that's made from the original language. So it's necessary to go back to the original Hebrew, it's necessary to go back to the original Greek, and then to see in the history of the translations what's happened, how to understand some of the problems in the text. So it's crucial that we work on a translation that has a scholarly foundation, one in which the scholars have tried to find an accurate version of these texts. As you know, in the course of copying, mistakes can get made. And the fact is, we do not have the original autograph, that is, the manuscript that the actual author himself wrote. Those who composed the Bible and what texts that they themselves made are now gone. All we have are copies that were made subsequent in history and then copies made after that. And when scribal errors have crept in, modern scholars have had to work hard to restore the original readings and to make good sense of the text. And then the translator has to try to find a way to render this that's easily understandable in our modern idiom. There's even a problem about vocabulary. In the Hebrew text of the Bible, there are only about 5,000 different words that occur. Many of them are used many, many times. But curiously, I found this so fascinating when I first learned it. Curiously, 40% of those words, about 2,000 of them, they only occur once. And there are no ancient dictionaries of biblical Hebrew. So what we have to do is to rely upon context for the meaning of those words. In recent years, we've also had archaeological discoveries of other texts in other ancient Near Eastern languages, and if those same words are present in both, we have an even better sense of what those words mean. Because they occur only once, and because many of them are names, we are very, very clear on the meaning of most verses in the Bible. But on the other hand, there are a few problems, and it's only fair to acknowledge those. And scholars have gotten some wonderful methods for trying to resolve the various difficulties. But there is also the problem of finding a translator with appropriate rhetoric for us, that is, appropriate literary skills and theological skills, sensitive to the connotations of different words and phrases, and the ability to turn that phrase into appropriate language in a new version for us in English. For the sake of beginning of our study with the book of Proverbs, I'll be using the translation that's called the New International Version, something produced by the International Bible Society. We'll be able to sample some of the other translations by yet other translators when we turn to other books of the Bible, and I look forward to our study.
Okay, that's it. Now, we're not going to get necessarily into Job in this course of study. However, if we finish early enough, we will. And Father Katersky then will, again, I'll have him on at the last half hour. Are there any questions of anybody of what we're going to be doing for the rest? If you could read the introduction, that'll tell you a little bit about how Catholics are to read the Bible, you know, the different senses, the literal, the analogical, and so forth, and which is going to be a little bit different than other religions, you know, because, for example, we use a lot of topology in the Catholic Church, you know, in other words, something that occurs in the Old Testament is revealed in the New. And to be able to understand that, like Matthew is just loaded with how Christ fulfills so many promises and about the Messiah, and it's incredible, like over 400 or so. So that's kind of, and you can see what Father Katersky has to say about a lot of different things. Sometimes he's going to cover things that I won't, and he covers it a lot better than I do, because he's, you know, was a regular professor and taught all this, and for the last 40 years I've been working at a sewage treatment plant. Big difference. So any other questions? So if we have a few minutes, if you want to go around, starting with Mary, to just kind of introduce yourself and say just a little bit about yourself. Ursula, you're up next.
really